On March 24, 603, inside the private chambers of Richmond Palace, a sickening stench music began to seep through the cold stone corridors. Courers who dared to approach the closed doors pressed, perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, but nothing could music disguise the unmistakable smell of rotting flesh. Inside that room, Elizabeth Tutt, the woman who had transformed England into a global power, was dying in the most degrading way imaginable, refusing to lie down in her bed while her own body decayed around her. To understand the full weight of this tragedy, we need to go back just a few weeks earlier, when the 69-year-old Queen was still presiding over her court with the iron authority that had defined her reign for nearly half a century. Elizabeth I had ruled Music England since 1558, navigating conspiracies, wars, and assassination attempts with a political cunning that terrified her enemies. But in the winter of something began to shift quietly at first, and then irreversibly. The change began in February, after the death of Elizabeth's closest friend, Catherine Howard, the Countess of Nottingham. Catherine carried a secret with her to the grave, a secret tied to the Queen's last great love, Robert de Vaux, the Earl of Essex, who had been executed for treason years earlier. As she lay dying, Catherine confessed that she had intercepted a letter from Essex written before his execution, desperately begging the Queen for forgiveness. That letter had never reached Elizabeth. Elizabeth had ordered the execution of the man she loved, believing he had never asked for mercy. The revelation shattered her. Contemporary records, preserved in the Royal Archives, describe a dramatic transformation. The normally controlled and calculating Queen began refusing food. Robert Seel, her Secretary of State, noted in private letters that Elizabeth went days without speaking a single word. She would stand motionless for hours, staring into nothingness. And when she finally spoke, she repeated the same question again and again, her voice barely audible. "Must I depart? Must I depart?" But Elizabeth Tudor did not depart quietly. What followed was a prolonged and horrifying decline that shocked even the most hardened observers of the age. The Queen, who had been obsessed with her image, her reputation, and the projection of eternal authority, began showing deeply alarming symptoms. Her ladies-in-waiting recorded the appearance of open sores across her skin. Her mouth began to swell grotesquely, and from her body came a foul, putrid odor that no perfume could mask. The physicians of the court, led by Dr. John Dee, suspected poisoning, specifically lead in mercury. For decades, Elizabeth had covered her music face with Sucia Venice, a white cosmetic paste made from lead carbonate music and vinegar, commonly used by noble women to achieve pale skin. Elizabeth applied it daily in thick layers, creating the ghostly white mask that became her iconic image. But lead is a slow poison. It accumulates silently in the body, and after more than 45 years of constant use, it was finally exacting its toll. The mercury came from an even more disturbing source. Elizabeth had suffered from smallpox in her youth, a disease that left scars on her face and body. For years afterward, she was treated with mercury-based ointments, a common medical practice at the time, and a lethal one. Mercury seeped through her skin, accumulating in her organs, poisoning her slowly, drop by drop, over decades. Yet, the most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's final days was not the physical suffering itself. It was her absolute refusal to accept death. By March of 1603, Elizabeth had developed a severe abscess in her throat. Swallowing became nearly impossible. Her tongue swelled until her speech grew slurred and indistinct. The sores on her skin began to rupture and ooze, staining her clothing with bodily fluids. The stench grew so unbearable that even her most loyal courtiers hesitated before entering her presence, and still Elizabeth refused to lie down. Elizabeth Southwell, one of her closest attendants, recorded in her diary that the Queen remained seated on cushions placed directly on the floor for 4 consecutive days and nights. She would not allow herself to be moved to her bed. When asked why, Elizabeth responded with chilling clarity. "If I lie down," she said, "I shall never rise again." The courtiers watched in horror as the Queen of England, once the most powerful woman in the world, wasted away before their eyes. Her skin, already pale music beneath decades of toxic makeup, turned a sickly gray. Her hair, long hidden beneath elaborate wigs, had nearly fallen out entirely, a consequence of heavy metal poisoning. One by one, her jewels were removed as her fingers swelled grotesquely, the rings cutting painfully into her flesh. Robert Carey, her nephew, left a detailed account of these final days in his memoirs. He described Elizabeth sitting utterly still for hours, her finger resting in her mouth in a strangely childlike gesture, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. When she spoke, it was only to murmur fragments, half-formed thoughts, drifting in and out of coherence. "Essex," she whispered at times, the name of the man she had condemned to death. At other moments, she repeated the same haunting question. "Must I depart?" As the Queen's condition worsened, music panic spread quietly through the corridors of power. Elizabeth had never named an heir. For her entire reign, she had refused to discuss succession, understanding all too well that naming a successor would weaken her authority. But now, with the Queen clearly dying, the members of the Privy Council could no longer avoid the issue. Behind closed doors, they began making secret preparations. Finally, Robert Cecil gathered the courage to ask the question directly. Leaning close to the swollen, barely recognizable figure of the Queen, he spoke carefully. "Your Majesty, who shall succeed you?" What happened next would become one of the most unsettling moments in English royal history. Elizabeth could no longer speak. The swelling in her mouth and throat made words impossible. Slowly, trembling with effort, she raised her swollen hands above her head. With her fingers, she formed the shape of a crown. Then she pointed north toward Scotland. She was naming James V, 6th of Scotland, the son of Mary Stuart. The irony was merciless. For much of her reign, Elizabeth had devoted enormous energy to destroying Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, her rival, and a constant threat to her throne. Mary had been imprisoned for 19 years before. Elizabeth finally ordered her execution music in 1587, and now, in her final moments, Elizabeth was handing her crown to Mary's son. It was as if fate itself were delivering a final cruel joke to a woman who believed she could control everything. In the days that followed, Elizabeth's condition deteriorated beyond anything her court had music imagined. The sores on her skin multiplied, spreading into weeping ulcers that covered her body. The abscess in her throat grew so large that breathing became a laborious, music-rasping struggle, a sound so harsh it could be heard through closed doors. The cushions she sat upon became soaked with fluids leaking from her body, creating a grotesque scene that no court painter would ever dare to record. And still, for 4 days, she remained seated on the floor, clinging stubbornly to consciousness, defying the bed she believed would be her final prison. Eventually, she was persuaded to lie down, and just as she had predicted, once she did, she would never rise again. Once Elizabeth finally allowed herself to be laid upon the bed, her strength collapsed with frightening speed. The moment her body surrendered to the mattress, it was as if some final barrier had broken. For 3 agonizing days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, her poisoned body no longer able to sustain the fight she had music waged for decades. Those closest to her watched, helplessly as the woman who had ruled England with unmatched authority now lay nearly motionless, her breathing shallow and irregular. At times her eyes would open, still sharp with flashes of intelligence, as if her mind were desperately trying to assert control over a body that had already betrayed her. Then, just as suddenly, she would sink back into silence. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whit, was summoned to administer the last rites. He stood beside the bed, reciting prayers meant to prepare the soul for death. But Elizabeth was beyond response. Her swollen tongue and throat made speech impossible, and her awareness faded in long, uneven waves. The rituals continued regardless, carried out more for the comfort of the living than for the dying queen herself. In the early hours of March 24, at around 3 o'clock in the morning, Elizabeth I of England finally died. But the horror did not end with her final breath. When the time came to prepare the queen's body for the state funeral, the ladies of the court discovered music. The true extent of what decades of poisoning and weeks of agony had done to her. Lady Southwell, entrusted with dressing the corpse, left behind a confidential account that remained hidden in family archives for centuries. Elizabeth's body had already begun to decompose at an alarming rate. Her corpse was grotesquely swollen, so distended that it became difficult to dress her in her ceremonial garments. The long-term poisoning by lead and mercury had left her organs in an advanced state of decay even before death had occurred. The skin she had worked so obsessively to keep pale and flawless was now blotched, discolored, and mottled with dark patches. The open sores that had covered her body and life continued to leak fluids in death. Even more disturbing was the condition of her abdomen. Elizabeth's stomach was unnaturally distended, giving her body the appearance of pregnancy. Historians have debated the cause for centuries. Some suggest ovarian cancer, a condition more common in women who never bore children. Others argue that heavy metal poisoning caused ascites, a buildup of fluid in the abdominal cavity. Whatever the cause, the result was deeply unsettling. The Virgin Queen, who had turned her chastity into a political weapon for 45 years, now appeared grotesquely pregnant in death. The coffin had to be sealed quickly. The stench of decomposition was already overwhelming. Yet, even after being enclosed, the odor could not be fully contained. During the state funeral procession on April 28, those tasked with carrying the coffin later reported a nauseating smell leaking through the seams. The procession through London was hurried, not out of reverence, but necessity. The body inside the coffin was breaking down at such a rate that delay was not an option. And still, the story did not end there. Years later, during renovations at Westminster Abbey in the 19th century, Elizabeth's tomb was opened. What the workers found shocked everyone present. The lead coffin that held her remains had been corroded from the inside out. The levels of toxic substances within Elizabeth's body had been so high that the fluids produced during decomposition became chemically aggressive. They had eaten through the metal itself. Modern medical analysis of historical accounts paints a terrifying clinical picture. Elizabeth suffered from chronic lead and mercury poisoning. These toxins would have caused kidney failure, severe liver damage, and possibly cancer. The skin lesions, described by her attendants, align closely with symptoms of heavy metal intoxication. The swelling in her throat may have been a tumor or an abscess caused by the collapse of her immune system. Her erratic mental state in her final days, shifting between clarity and confusion, is characteristic of toxic encephalopathy. She had been poisoning herself for decades in pursuit of an image. The white mask she presented to the world, the pale, impassive face that became synonymous with Tudor majesty, was crafted from the very substances that killed her. Power, youth, and control. Music came at a cost she could not escape. The death of Elizabeth I was more than the end of a reign. It was a parable about vanity and the hidden price of authority. This was a woman whose era still bears her name, who defeated the Spanish Armada, who transformed England into a global power, who maneuvered men and nations like pieces on a chessboard. And yet, she could not defeat the enemy growing inside her own body. In the months following her death, the court of James I worked carefully to erase the most grotesque details of Elizabeth's final days. Official portraits showed a serene, dignified queen, untouched by decay. Public accounts described a peaceful, noble passing. But in private letters, confidential diaries, and sealed medical records, the truth survived. Elizabeth Tudor did not die gently. She died rotting alive, fully aware of what was happening, refusing to surrender control even as her body failed her. Perhaps the most tragic detail of all is that Elizabeth knew, in her final moments of clarity, when she looked at her ladies with eyes still sharp with intelligence, set in a swollen, disfigured face, she understood exactly what music was happening. The woman who had controlled every detail of her public image music for 45 years was losing control of her own body in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. Today, when visitors stand before her tomb in Westminster Abbey, they see a beautiful marble effigy. Elizabeth is carved in eternal peace, hands folded in prayer, her face calm beneath a majestic crown. It is a comforting lie, frozen in stone. The truth lives elsewhere in hidden documents, whispered accounts that survive centuries, and medical details historians rarely discuss. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana herself, who once declared she had the heart of a king in the body of a weak woman, spent her final days seated on cushions soaked with bodily fluids. Her face was covered in sures, her body was swollen and decaying, and she refused to lie down because she knew that once she did, she would never rise again. And she was right. In the weeks after Elizabeth's death, England moved forward with practice efficiency. Power transferred smoothly. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns just as Elizabeth had silently indicated in her final moments. To the outside world, the transition appeared orderly, dignified, almost serene, but beneath the surface, there was an unspoken urgency to control the narrative. James Court understood something instinctively. The truth of Elizabeth Tudor's final days could never be allowed to define her legacy. The woman who had ruled for 45 years could not be remembered as a rotting, swollen body that refused to lie down. She had to remain Gloriana, ageless, commanding, untouched. So the story was rewritten. Official proclamations described music a calm passing, a queen who slipped peacefully into death, surrounded by prayer. Artists were commissioned to produce music. Portraits that erased any hint of decay. Smooth skin, bright eyes, regal posture, no sures, no swelling, no stench. The Elizabeth presented to history was frozen at her peak, not revealed at her end. Yet the truth lingered in places that could not be fully erased. In private music correspondence, courtiers hinted at what they had witnessed. In diaries meant never for public eyes. Ladies of the bedchamber recorded scenes so disturbing they barely dared to put them into words. Physicians left fragmented notes describing symptoms they did not fully understand, but could not ignore. Centuries later, historians and medical experts would piece these fragments together. What emerged was not a mystery, but a slow-motion catastrophe. Elizabeth's body had been under siege for decades. Lead poisoning alone can cause chronic pain, neurological damage, kidney failure, and skin breakdown. Mercury adds tremors, confusion, immune collapse, and organ failure. Combined, they create a perfect storm of deterioration. Yet even then, she refused to relinquish control. Elizabeth Tudor had spent her entire reign mastering the art of image. She understood better than almost any ruler before her that perception was power. Her virginity was not simply personal. It was political. Her appearance was not vanity. It was authority made visible. Every gesture, every outfit, every carefully composed expression was calculated. The white makeup that concealed her scars also concealed weakness. The elaborate wigs disguised thinning hair. The jewels drew attention away from aging hands. Even silence, when she chose it, music became a weapon. So when death approached, Elizabeth reacted the only way she knew how. She resisted. She refused a bed, not because she did not understand what was happening, but because she understood it too well. To lie down was to admit defeat. To lie down was to become mortal. To lie down was to allow her body, not her will, to decide the end. For 4 days, music she sat upright, her body failing, her mind slipping in and out of clarity. Clinging to music, the last illusion of command. Courtiers could not force her. Physicians could not persuade her. Even as fluids soaked the cushions beneath her, even as her breath grew labored and foul, she held her ground. It was an act of defiance, worthy of the woman she had always been. And when she finally did lie down, the end came swiftly. There is something deeply unsettling about that final resistance, not because it was futile, but because it was so human. Elizabeth I, the near-mythic ruler, stripped of ceremony and spectacle, faced the same terror that has haunted every human being who ever lived, the loss of control. In life, she controlled men, parliaments, armies, and music nations. In death, she could not control her own cells turning against her. The poisons she used to preserve power became the agents of her destruction. The image she built to inspire fear and loyalty consumed her from the inside out, and she knew it. That awareness is what makes her death so haunting. This was not ignorance. This was not confusion. This was a woman who understood cause and consequence. Watching the final bill come due, the same intelligence that had outmaneuvered kings and popes recognized the truth in those final moments. Elizabeth Tutter was dying because of the very tools she used to survive. The white mask that made her immortal in portraiture was a lie painted in lead. The treatments meant to preserve her body destroyed it. The illusion of eternal authority could not stop time, chemistry, or decay. By the time her coffin was sealed, by the time London hurried her funeral procession, by the time the marble effigy was carved in Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth herself was already gone, reduced to a narrative carefully shaped by those who needed stability more than truth. And yet the truth endured. It endured in the corroded lead coffin. It endured in the medical symptoms that refused to align with a peaceful passing. It endured in the smell that could not be contained. It endured because history, no matter how carefully managed, leaves traces. When we stand before Elizabeth's tomb today, we are not looking at her. We are looking at the version England music needed her to be. Calm, pure, victorious, eternal. The real Elizabeth, the woman ended her life swollen, disfigured, leaking, and terrified of surrender. Not because she was weak, but because she had been strong for too long. Stronger than any body could endure. Her story is not diminished by this ending. It is deepened. Elizabeth I was not a goddess. She was not untouchable. She was a human being who built an empire while slowly destroying herself to maintain the illusion of power. Her death strips away the marble, the myths, and the propaganda, revealing something far more unsettling than failure. Music reveals truth, and that truth is this: power can command nations, but it cannot command mortality. Image can rule minds, but it cannot rule the body. And even the greatest monarchs, in the end, must face what they spent a lifetime trying to deny. Elizabeth Tudor ruled as long as will could overcome flesh. And when flesh finally won, she refused to lie down. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more disturbing hidden truths from history, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Leave a comment below and tell us which monarch or historical figure you want to see uncovered in a future